Welcome back to another edition of the Pagcast. I'm your host, Michael Pagani, joined alongside Wes Gilbertson of the Calgary Sun. He covers the Calgary Flames. Wes, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. How about you?
Well, I'm doing great, thanks. I've been watching a lot of the Euros on top of the crazy action going on around the NHL. I'm not sure if you've been watching the same.
I haven't caught a ton of the Euros, but I look forward to kind of watching it as we go down the stretch. It once we get into, the kind of play in or not play in the playoff round, probably get a little more into it. But I'd be lying to you if I told you I'd watched much of it yet.
And has your attention been turned towards more the NHL playoff action then?
Yeah, I mean, covering the league all season long, I certainly pay attention when it gets down to the nitty gritty like this. So it's been a fascinating playoffs. I'm one of those guys who kind of can't stop watching usually in like the first round when there's three games a night or whatever. And then just kind of follow it through. It's been some unexpected storylines. Obviously, I don't think anyone saw the Montreal Canadiens being where they are, let alone now being up in that series. So it's been fun. It's been fun to watch.
We did just finish a season like any other without fans in Canada for the whole regular season, as we see Quebec expanded their capacity for the Montreal Canadiens to have fans. How did you enjoy this season without fans, or did you not enjoy it?
I wouldn't say I didn't enjoy it, but it's just not the same. And I think anyone would answer the question the same way. I'm fortunate enough that I was one of the ones inside the arena this season, and certainly feel pretty lucky to have been there. But when there's a big goal or a big hit or a big penalty kill or all these moments that can turn the momentum and crank the volume in the building, like it's just not. Sorry, here I just it's just not the same. So
Yeah.
okay, sorry. I just had a call coming in, and I'm not sure if it
No
popped
worries.
up
No,
on
I
my
got I got
screen.
your full answer.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so it's just not the same at all. I think we're all looking forward, even as you started watching the playoffs and you saw these full buildings or these half full buildings, and the amount of noise that gets generated and the way that the game kind of feeds off that crowd noise. It makes such a huge difference that good on the NHL for playing this season. I think it entertained a lot of people. I think that they addressed a lot of the safety concerns quite well, and invested a lot of money to make sure everyone stayed safe. But it's not the same in empty or even half empty buildings. So I think we're all excited to get back to that.
Did your game day routine change at all, given that it was just the media going to the arenas and not seeing fans in the stands each game?
Well, it changed in the sense that, we used to go to morning skate and then go into the locker room and talk to the players, and with everything done by Zoom, that certainly changed the routine a lot, or changed how we do our jobs. The actual game part of it didn't change a ton. Again, no locker room access after, so you're waiting for a player to hop on a Zoom call. But and then for the most part, the last 9 seasons, I've done a ton of travel with the Flames, and so the game day routine changes a lot. Obviously, when you're not on the road and the team is, you can't watch morning skate. You're watching the game, on your TV, and so that I guess is probably the biggest difference for me.
Getting into your story a bit here, who influenced you to get into sports reporting?
I wouldn't say it was a specific person. I was a newspaper delivery boy as a kid. I've always been a sports junkie. When other kids were watching cartoons, I was watching baseball games or hockey games. So I don't think I don't have like a reporter who I wanted to be when I grew up or anything like that. But always kind of fascinated by that side of the industry, and it just seemed like a good fit for me.
One aspect that is very key for sports reporting, especially, is building that close relationship with the player. In your opinion, how important is that aspect?
I think it's probably what separates the people who are okay at what they do in our business and the people who are good at what they do. I mean, it's sort of like asking someone a question in a grocery store. If you have no rapport with that person, then you're just going to get a very basic answer. Whereas if you're asking, a friend that question, you get a much more insightful answer. They're willing maybe to tell you something that they wouldn't just tell a stranger. And so, maybe that's a bad example because I'm not saying that I'm friends with all the players that I cover, but when you have that relationship that they know you, they've seen me at the Saddledome, they've seen me at all these other arenas on the road. You hope that they, I guess, just respect the way you go about your business, and then you're going to get more, you're going to get more detail out of them. They're going to be willing to chat with you. They might be willing to share a story about their family or whatever, because they have that trust in you. And so I think, it's what makes it hard for people who are trying to cover teams without having access to the locker room or being at the rink every day. Like, it's such a huge component of what we do. And the second part of it then being kind of knowing what to ask, or knowing how to phrase a question to maybe get a little bit below the surface. I think, there's lots of people who are really good at, writing stuff down and, putting their thoughts on the page or analyzing a game some way. But I really do think that that's kind of one of the differentiators in my business anyways.
Do you believe that Zoom calls will be a part of the future for sports reporting? Because with Zoom calls, it's more difficult to build that close relationship with the player.
Yeah, I certainly hope not. Zoom has served a purpose, but I do believe that, one-on-one conversations in a locker room or even in a scrum setting is the way that works best for the media. And I think, quite frankly, it works better for the people being interviewed too. It's not as time consuming. You don't have the technical glitches that you have. So I think you'll maybe see some, like, I wouldn't be surprised if you see some media conferences via Zoom. If a team, signs a new player, instead of that player having to phone 10 different reporters for an interview, that they might use Zoom because everyone's so familiar with that technology. So, the Flames have just signed a free agent on Canada Day, and that player's at his cottage in Muskoka and he jumps on a Zoom call. I could see that. So I think there is a future for it a little bit, but I certainly hope it's not a day-to-day part of our lives once we're kind of in the back to normal phase.
Do you remember your last locker room scrum?
No, probably not. I mean, because there was nothing, just the way this kind of crept up. I wouldn't say there was anything like, oh, this is going to be the last day we're in here. I do remember as kind of fears spread about what was going on in the world, the NHL asked for basically more space between the players and the media. So I do remember one day, because I remember Travis Hamonic coming in to speak to the media, and he stood at like a podium, and we were in kind of a press conference room. But like, I was on a road trip. I can't remember how many games, like 4 or 5 games, finished in Florida. It was just like normal, and a week later the NHL shut down, and quite frankly, everything had changed as far as our generation knows it, or had both temporarily and in a lot of ways probably permanently changed. So I have no idea. If that last day I was in the locker room, I couldn't tell you who I talked to, what I talked about. The Flames, I think, had 3 or 4 days off before they were supposed to play the Islanders on the night that everything got paused. But yeah, I couldn't tell you much about it, to be honest.
Well, this past offseason, the Flames made big moves acquiring, Jacob Markstrom and Chris Tanev from both the Vancouver Canucks there. At the time, did you have any expectations, or what were your expectations on the Calgary Flames?
I mean, I think the additions combined with the lack of subtractions and I think one thing that everyone probably underestimated was how big of a loss TJ Brody was. So when I say loss of subtractions, I just thought that their defense had kind of filled that hole, and maybe a bunch of us were wrong about that part. And then if you look at the way they played in the bubble and the fact that they were, a mini meltdown away from taking a stranglehold in a series against the Dallas Stars, and then that falls apart. And so, yeah, I think it was realistic to think that they should be a challenger in the North Division. I think on paper, the Toronto Maple Leafs had separated themselves talent-wise, but I thought beyond that, I didn't think it was crazy to expect the Flames to be in the mix, for second, even for first in the division. And, I think the one thing about the North Division this year is every team had a lot of warts. It was easy to look and say, well, the Winnipeg Jets are pretty good, but what about this? The Vancouver Canucks could be pretty good, but what about this? The Edmonton Oilers have two of the best players in the world, but what about all these reasons? And so, I thought the very worst case scenario for the Flames was that they would be in a fight for a playoff spot right until the end and not get in. But to be kind of out of it with, a few weeks left in the season was a worst case scenario than I could have imagined.
Do you think that Jacob Markstrom's contract could potentially become a problem with Dustin Wolf's play in the WHL and just basically setting records with his team there?
No, I don't think so. I think the one thing about signing a goalie last offseason is you got him at a really good AAV. I mean, $6 million a year for a goaltender of Jacob Markstrom's, class, stature, however you want to put it. He's in the upper echelon of guys in the league, and I would never hesitate to pay an upper echelon guy that amount of money because of a kid who was on the way. And the thing, Dustin Wolf's an awesome kid. I love chatting with him. He's competitive even on a phone call, which I think is such a great trait. Like the fire just burns in him all the time. But he's listed in the dub at 6 feet, and so he was standing on his skates when they measured him because he's not 6 feet tall, and there's not a lot of sub 6 foot goalies. We saw what Saros did for the Nashville Predators, and I think that is kind of the roadmap for Dustin Wolf. The other kind of good example, and I won't even try to pronounce his last name, but Ned in Carolina, is 6 foot, and so there are guys like Dustin Wolf who are athletic and competitive and technically sound and read the game well. They can have success in the NHL. But when you're 5'11", it's going to be a question mark as a goalie. So if you can get a 6'6" goalie who's already established for that annual value, the problem you'd love to have is Dustin Wolf is so good in 3 years that you say, we got to make him our starter. What do we do now? But I don't think you necessarily worry about that.
Like you mentioned, the Flames, finished 5th in the North Division this year, and it was actually a tight race between them and Montreal, which ultimately came down to games in hand during that stretch. From a reporting standpoint, how fun was it to cover, two teams basically going hand in hand for that last spot in the North Division?
Well, I think it just never really turned into that because of the games in hand. And so, there was basically a couple of days where the Flames had won a couple of games head to head against Montreal, needed basically to sweep a 3-game mini series against them, got 2 out of 3, but with the games in hand, they finished 4 points back. They got 6 points out of those 4 meaningless games against the Vancouver Canucks that people wondered if they would even play at the end of the season. So really, when the season ended, they were 10 points back, and so it just never really seemed like it was close. Like it just never. I've covered some playoff races that have come right down to the wire. This team needs to win or they need this team to lose or whatever in the final 3 games of the season. And those are a blast, but this just never was that for me. It never really felt that close. And then, the Canadians would lose a couple and the Flames would win a couple. It'd be maybe close for a night. And then suddenly the gap would be big enough again that Montreal had that breathing room. So it just never really got there for me, to be honest.
Speaking on that point you brought up about the meaningless games, a lot of people were criticizing the NHL for allowing the Vancouver Canucks to come back and, resume play after their COVID bout with a variant. Did you agree with the NHL's decision at the time, or are you still criticizing them of what happened?
No, I don't criticize it. I mean, I don't think, no team would wish to go through what the Vancouver Canucks went through. And, for those players and their families, it sounds like, from everything I've heard of, it was a very scary few weeks. And yet, the NHL got to 56 games with every one of their teams, and they lengthened the schedule by a week and a half or whatever the final tally was for the Vancouver Canucks to get theirs in. There's a lot at play there, right? There's a lot of people who would have presumably been owed money if those games didn't get played. I mean, TV deals and, board sponsors and helmet sponsors and like everything, radio deal, like this is all based on a number of games played. And so I'm not saying that the economics should ever override the human element of it, but I guess, that situation to me was pushed to that edge. But I think in the end, I was comfortable with what ended up happening. If I was someone in Vancouver, maybe I would disagree. Certainly they felt the rigors of it a lot more than any of us could even imagine. But I wasn't openly critical at the time of the NHL, and I still don't think I would be of the way that was handled.
During the season, down the stretch, the Flames fired Jeff Ward and hired Daryl Sutter. Did you think that was the right move?
I think a coaching change in the middle of a season is really difficult at the best of times. And then a coaching change in the middle of a 56-game season, that's really tough. And so was it the right move to get the team into the playoffs this year? I'm not sure about that. Now, is it the right move for the future of the Calgary Flames? I think that remains to be seen. Daryl Sutter, his style is well documented. There's been a long line of coaches come through Calgary. Brad Treliving as general manager is on his 5th head coach now, which is pretty close to unheard of in terms of the lifespan of a general manager. And yet they haven't had a coach with the pedigree of Daryl Sutter. He's won 2 Stanley Cups. As we're reminded every time there's a Game 7 on TV, he's won more Game 7s as a head coach than anyone in NHL history. So, this is a guy who's literally been there and done that and won that, and there's value that comes with that. I think in terms of changing the culture, which is something we throw around a lot, and I don't think anyone really knows the quote unquote culture of a team, but in terms of, that tone setting, just kind of, I guess, sparking a turnaround for the franchise. He's the kind of guy that they haven't had. They haven't had a guy with that much success or that much experience or who can probably be that much of a hard ass. So, this is new for the Calgary Flames. And so, was it the right move on March the 4th? I can't remember exactly which. I think it was March the 4th. In terms of getting into the playoffs, I'm not sure. Certainly the results would tell you that it didn't help them get in the playoffs, but are those extra 30 some games of experience under Daryl Sutter the chance for him to lead the exit interviews, to have his say on who can be part of a winning team moving forward? That could really prove invaluable for this franchise. And so for that reason, if this team is growing into a contender in a couple of seasons, then it was absolutely the right move.
Does it give you a fresh breath of air having a coach give quick, witty answers to some of the reporters' questions?
I don't know if it's a fresh breath of air. I mean, certainly with Daryl, you never know what the response is going to be. He certainly arrives at his post-game Zoom call with a message that he'd like to send, whether it was, he didn't like this penalty, or he didn't have enough guys going, or he, whatever it is. When he's not waiting for the right question. If he's got something he wants to get off his chest, you're going to hear it pretty quickly. So, he's a very interesting guy to interview. But, doesn't really change. It's not like, when the Zoom call ends, I have an extra pep in my step that I didn't have under Jeff Ward, who is quite frankly one of the best people I've ever dealt with in this industry. You talk about guys that you'd like to just sit down and have a beer with. Well, Jeff Ward was, one of the best in that category. And sorry, I'm not saying I ever sat down for a beer with him. I'm just saying that's the kind of guy you'd love to hang out with and hear stories and pick his brain. So, two totally different guys in the way they approach the media and the way they answer questions. But I wouldn't say that's just part of being in the media. Our job can't change when the coach does. So it just kind of keep doing what we do. We have a job to do as well, and doesn't really change that part of it.
We saw the emergence of Elias Lindholm, Dylan Dubé, and Andrew Mangiapane, among others. Just three to note there. And, Dubé's in for a payday. Mangiapane has 1 year left on his deal. How important is it for Daryl Sutter to keep that core of guys together, and Brad Treliving?
Well, I think the question first has to be what happens with the other core. Elias Lindholm is in the core of this team, at 4.85. He was their, I guess, second leading scorer. They voted a team MVP this year. He won that award. He plays number one center minutes. He's arguably the most important person on the roster. And so you have a core that includes him, Johnny Gaudreau, Sean Monaghan, Matthew Tkachuk, obviously, Mark Giordano, I would still put in that category, Jacob Markstrom, so the first question is what happens with the other core? I think the world of Andrew Mangiapane is a player like nobody works harder. I think Dylan Dubé has a good future ahead of him, and certainly showed glimpses of what he can be this season. But if your core is Dubé, Mangiapane, and Elias Lindholm, you're not going to be a great team in this league. So you need to supplement those guys. Like, those are the kind of middle. And sorry, I'll leave Lindholm's a top line piece, but Mangiapane and Dylan Dubé, those are the sort of middle six pieces you find on championship teams. Those are the kind of guys who can be second and third line players on really good teams. But the core needs more first line players. The core is going to need a stud defenseman when Mark Giordano is too old to be the stud defenseman. The core needs Jacob Markstrom to play like he was signed to play. And so that to me is a bigger question. Is Andrew Mangiapane about to get paid? World championship MVP, just scored a career high in both goals and points in a shortened season. Absolutely. Is Dylan Dubé going to get a nice raise on his next contract? He should, as long as he's consistently using his speed and tenacity. He can be a really effective player in this league. So those guys are nice pieces, but the questions are higher on the pay grade right now.
Just speaking about Andrew Mangiapane's Worlds, like you mentioned there, do you find it incredible that not only was it after the season, but he also had to quarantine and he was still named MVP for Team Canada?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty impressive, right? You miss 3 games, you tie for the lead in goals, you score, the tournament lead in goals, you score the overtime winner in the quarters, you score twice in the semis. Yeah, what more could you ask for? And it'll be really good for him going forward. There's a chance that he was in a top line role on a watered down Team Canada at a watered down tournament, but the gold medal, they don't put those asterisks on the gold medal. So for him not only to come home with one of those, but to come home with the MVP trophy, and really just to it doesn't matter if we're talking NHL or Worlds or the Quebec Pee Wee tournament. You learn something about players when, like, hey, we need a goal now. Who's going to go get it? Well, the fact that Andrew Mangiapane was that guy, on that stage, that's just such good news for the Calgary Flames. They need him to be that in the NHL, and he's getting close to being that. In those 3 must-win games against the Canadians that they didn't win the third one, those first 2 games, he was the Flames' best player. And you learn a lot about guys in that scenario. So, this guy has a very bright future. Maybe he could be a first liner in the NHL. I think you kind of base everything on, well, we want to be a championship team. Well, okay, then Andrew Mangiapane is probably a second liner on a championship team, but I think he can be that, and that's still a hell of a compliment.
Did the schedule for the NHL this season, going up against really your only, only in the division, did that get repetitive for you after a few months?
Yeah, very, very. Yeah, it's let's get back to playing all the teams and seeing all the star players again. The NHL did a heck of a job this season, keeping everyone safe, but when you're playing the Winnipeg Jets for the 3rd time in 4 days. And I kind of like the back-to-backs, I wouldn't hate to see, makes a lot of sense for travel reasons. For the teams, could the Calgary Flames go into Pittsburgh and play the Penguins twice in 3 days? Sure. Does that make more sense than them playing, the Penguins on Thursday and the Philadelphia Flyers on Saturday? Very well could. But this 3 and 4 against the same opponent, and you might play them again, the next week. Repetitive is a really good word for it, and not to complain about it, but we all thought, oh, this North Division is going to be so awesome, right? Well, was there one game, so we go back to just before the pandemic, Matthew Tkachuk and Zach Kassian had, started or restarted their feud. Then we're looking at, Cam Talbot and Mike Smith, fighting at center ice. Like that next game after Tkachuk and Kassian, it was like everyone in the hockey world was watching. Everyone wanted to see that next game and see what happened, right? And I think we kind of thought that was going to happen a whole bunch in the North Division. And was there one game this season that you marked on your calendar as two nights earlier or something to happen and you said, I have to watch this game? Maybe I'm missing one in my head, but I honestly don't know that there was. There were nights when we talked about how boring a McDavid Matthews matchup had been, and that shouldn't be happening. And that's not a knock on the players who are just trying to march through the grind of this 56 games and 114 nights or whatever it was. But in terms of delivering that excitement that we all thought, I just don't think. I think the repetition took away from that.
And I also think, to add on to your points, I think that a lot of different teams, right, they like to use other teams as measuring stick games, where really the only team you could do that against was Toronto, because they kind of ran away with the division in the regular season. If you wanted to play Boston, well, you couldn't really do that this year.
Yeah, it's what makes the conference finals so interesting. If, or if we're calling them the conference finals, the league semifinals, and the fact, like, I think the best hockey potentially we're going to see this season is that Vegas Colorado series. And I could be wrong. I'd love for the best hockey we see this season to be the Stanley Cup final. It'll certainly be the most intense, but you look at that and it's like, okay, well, how's Montreal going to compete with this? And yet here we are talking, on a Saturday morning or afternoon, and Montreal's up 2-1. And so, maybe that changes the way we think about the North Division this season, or maybe you look at the shots on goal last night and go, yeah, Montreal's been in way over their head, and the North really was a crummy division. And if we as fans and media are trying to figure out, well, what teams are any good and what divisions, well, the teams and the players have been trying to do the same themselves all season. It's what makes the job, for Brad Treliving really fascinating this offseason is, your team underachieved. You've got a fan base that's ready for some significant changes, and yet you're going into a really junky Pacific Division next year, right? You've got the Vegas Golden Knights, which by then could be the defending Stanley Cup champions, and what they've done in their 4 seasons in the league is incredible. You've got the 2 best players, not the 2 best players in the world, but 2 of the top 7 or whatever in Edmonton. You have the best player in the world, and then wherever you want to put Draisaitl, and it's not very far down the list. So you have 2 really good teams there, and then you've got and then you've got Calgary, who underachieved. You've got the California teams who all are in the stages of a rebuild. You have an expansion team in Seattle, and then you've got Vancouver, who's got a bunch of money tied up in a bunch of veterans, has to figure out how to pay these kids, and seem to be kind of wandering in their own way right now. So, if you're Brad Treliving, you'd love to be able to say, well, here's where we think we fit in next year in the Pacific Division. But how do you do that when you haven't played the San Jose Sharks in, almost 2 years?
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's really difficult. Yeah, it's really difficult.
Well, I was just going to add on saying, like, the Seattle Kraken, new team, and, like we saw with the Vegas Golden Knights at their expansion draft, hopefully we don't see that again, because that would be quite the storyline. But yeah, like, we don't know how well Calgary is going to play if they're going up against San Jose, California teams, which they haven't seen in over 2 years. It's very crazy to wrap your mind around just like, okay, now we're getting back to the normal divisions, and really we don't know how well these teams stack up.
Yeah, it's a huge, and if we're wondering about it, imagine being one of the guys who's, making $1 million to put a team on the ice, or making several $1 million to be the roster architect of a team, or whatever an NHL GM gets paid these days. I really have no clue. So, yeah, it'll be a fascinating season ahead. There's still some fascination left in this one, so let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. But next one is going to be really fascinating as well.
Speaking on the Calgary offseason that's upcoming, or is now underway, I guess I should say, like you mentioned with the fans, they want, Brad Treliving to really make some big roster changes, which includes the likes of Sean Monaghan and Johnny Gaudreau. In your opinion, what should Brad do? What is the best situation for the Calgary Flames to do with them?
With those 2 guys specifically?
Yeah.
I think when you've underachieved the way that this Flames team has, to get this long list of untouchable players makes no sense. I think you look at everything. And so, do I see Johnny Gaudreau being on the Flames roster next season? Yeah, absolutely. I do personally. I think it's as much about what his value might be, though. Like, here's a guy who's got 1 year left before he's a free agent. You read some of these, trade proposals on different sites or on social media, and it's like, you're not robbing the farm for a guy who's going to be a free agent in a year. Sean Couturier is one of the best 2-way centers in the league. Do people think that Philadelphia is going to send him to Calgary for Johnny Gaudreau? I don't think so, right? Travis Konechny, like, you read all these things and it's like, oh, oh my goodness, like, oh, and they're going
Blasphemy.
to throw in a first round pick or whatever. So, Johnny Gaudreau has value after this past season. I think it's important for the Flames that he proved he could also be effective under Daryl Sutter. And I personally thought those two were going to mix like oil and water. So that's good. And then you kind of look at Sean Monahan as well. And, here's a guy who's, scored 25 or 30 goals for fun every season. He's one of the, I believe he's the leading goal scorer from a draft class that includes Nathan McKinnon. That's pretty damn impressive. And yet he just put 10 in. He's coming off another hip surgery. So, what's his value? What are you hoping to turn him into? And so to answer your question in a roundabout way, I think you gauge the market on guys if you feel like, you might not be able to build around them. But for different reasons right now, whether it's contractually with Gaudreau or it's performance-wise last season with Monaghan, their value is not sky high. I mean, could you get something for Sean Monahan? Well, of course you can get something, but he just scored 10 goals and then he had hip surgery and he's already not a great skater. And so, I don't know that there's a team that's necessarily, unloading a bunch of picks or prospects for a guy like that. And I don't know that your team is in a position, for a lot of the reasons that we talked about with what the division is going to look like next year, that you just want picks and prospects. I mean, Brad Treliving wants to keep his job here in Calgary, and I don't think the mandate is rebuilt. So I'd kind of test the market on everybody. This team needs one significant change for sure, but I just don't know exactly who it's going to be.
Calgary is drafting 12th overall this year. To my demise, I kind of wish the draft lottery had more hype. I got to say that one after the bubble last year was quite intense, and I enjoyed every bit of it. But anyway, have you had time to look at any prospects this season?
No, and I know that there's some sites that do a really good job of it. And I really lean on those because there's a lot of NHL hockey to watch. And, as a guy who covers one team full time and has an awards ballot vote, I try to watch a ton of NHL hockey. And so for me to sit here and say, oh yeah, I was just watching, Mason McTavish play the other night, or, I didn't miss a game of Brant Clark at the U18s, like I'd be full of, what. So, so that's always kind of a late undertaking for me, is trying to learn some of the prospects in sort of the range the Flames might be picking in. I know that there's some depth. There's not a ton of high end. There's some depth in this first round. But I also know, because of the scouting challenges of this past season, that the draft boards are probably, really
Random.
different. Yeah. Like Flames picked 13th. I'm going to screw up the number, 13th, 16th, whatever, in 2017. You do all your research. Well, who could they get? Well, I didn't really know a whole lot about Juuso Välimäki, and that's who they took. They pick 26th a couple of years later. Did I know too much about Jacob Pelche? No, didn't happen to be on the list of targets. Maybe I guessed a little bit better last year because Connor Zary to the Flames made a ton of sense, for a lot of reasons. But who it might be at 12 this year, it's hard to guess at the best of times, and I just haven't had a chance to see any of these kids, so it's really tough for me to say.
We talk about trades and stuff with the Flames, but with the Sabres, they're thinking of shopping Jack Eichel to the Western Conference, especially. How might that impact the Calgary Flames?
Well, I mean, if you can pull off a trade for him, it would impact you a lot. You could add a bona fide superstar to the top of your roster, but do they have the pieces that the Buffalo Sabres are going to be looking for, or the appetite? Like if I'm the Buffalo Sabres, and the latest speculation I've heard is, that maybe the Anaheim Ducks throw in, the third overall pick and then a top flight prospect. Well, if that's what you're looking for, the Flames can't match that. They don't have that high pick. I'm not sure they have that top flight prospect, to be perfectly honest. Dustin Wolf is still a long shot for size reasons. Maybe long shot's not fair, but he's not the can't miss kid because he's not a big kid. Connor Zary and Jacob Pelche have, some interesting potential, but are they first line guys? I'm not sure, anyone's necessarily projecting that. So if I'm the Buffalo Sabres and Brad Schliving calls, I'm probably asking for Matthew Tkachuk and Andrew Mangiapane. And that, that's a big ask. And yet I think, the Flames would have to, if you want a superstar, they're not very easy to get. And, depending on what you think of Jack Eichel's health issues, then maybe you consider it. But they're not the most logical fit to me. But, we keep saying, well, Brad Schliving's got to make a big move. Well, this would be a doozy, right?
Where do you think this team can upgrade in the season or in the off season?
Basically everywhere. I mean, they need to find. They did not score a whole lot of goals, despite having quite a few guys that I think are offensively gifted. So you need to score more. You kind of pin that on your forwards. You need to find some stability on your blue line, Chris Tanev and whoever he played with. First it was Noah Hannafin and then it was Mark Giordano. That was your best pairing this season. You need one other pairing really solidified. And I expect that to happen easily enough with Rasmus Andersson because, I really do think he's a stud in the making, even though he didn't have a great season this year. So, but you need more out of some guys on the blue line. And so maybe that's internal. Maybe you go out and sign another veteran guy. And then you need a backup goalie and you need a guy who can spell off Jacob Markstrom on a more regular basis. And then you need him to play better. And so, it sounds like such a cop-out answer, but it's everywhere. This team after, the disappointing season, it just could be better everywhere.
Reflecting on your career as a Flames writer, or even just the past season, what was so fun about covering the Calgary Flames?
Well, the best, everyone wants to cover, playoff games and everyone, I guess everyone wants to write stories that people are reading. And so, it's pretty cool to have a quote unquote ticket on the nights everyone else wants to be in the building, whether that's, a playoff game or the night that Jerome McGinley's jersey was retired or there's been a lot of cool ones along the way. I've been really fortunate to be at, banner raisings and, clinching games or elimination games or overtime playoff games. And, this team hasn't had much success in my stint. They haven't been past the second round, but, all those kind of, playoff games and games that, I always say if you're going on, whatever website to find out how much tickets are and they're crazy expensive, well, we're pretty lucky to be in the building those nights.
As we wrap up this interview here, do you have any advice for aspiring sports writers?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, I think a big part of it is what we kind of talked about early, and the importance of asking good questions and developing relationships. And, I'll say two things. Sorry, I'm just trying to kind of think this one through in my head. There's a lot of platforms out there. And so, get your stuff out there, be proud of your work, and try to do the best work you can. And then, there's lots of places for young journalists to be published, even, whether it's online or maybe in smaller print publications. And I think that's really important. The other thing, and the advice I always give people is like read a couple people that you have a ton of respect for. And if you can, and once you get to that stage, read them in the same setting that you're in. And so, like I've covered Flames games, and I'll give you a few examples, whether it's Eric Francis, Scott Cruikshank, or Eric DeHatchik. There's usually a couple of really, really good writers there. And so you cover the game, and the next day you kind of see what you wrote and you see what they wrote. And if you have the respect for the competition like I have for those guys, that's the best way. See why they wrote a sentence different, see why they used a different quote that you didn't really think was very impactful. And there'll be days that you think you got it right, and that's great. And there's going to be days that you read theirs and go, oh my God, that's so much better than what I wrote, and you can really learn from both of those. So I think what maybe some aspiring journalists aren't doing enough of is reading. If you want to be a writer, read the people you respect. There's men and women in our business who are doing incredible work, and pick a couple of them, and you're going to learn a lot just from reading their stuff.
Well, I'd like to thank again Wes Gilbertson for joining me on today's Pagcast. Thank you again, Wes.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Have an awesome day.